In the past 7 days, Iran has endured almost non-stop bombing, and now it is gradually facing the threat of a large-scale ground invasion. However, the attacking forces are not directly American or Israeli soldiers, or if there are any, they will not be the main force in the actual battle. Instead, the Israeli Mossad, the CIA of the United States, and the air forces of both countries are said to be preparing to support a major ground offensive that will be led by Kurdish paramilitary forces. From the border of Iraq, thousands of Kurdish fighters are expected to cross into Iran, and this could possibly happen within just a few days, or even a few hours after this video is released. For the Kurdish fighters, this offensive is an opportunity to reclaim or establish part of their long-claimed ancestral land. However, for the United States and Israel, this is a plan that could push Iran toward the eventual collapse of the current regime. For several months, the Kurdish forces have been secretly preparing for this operation, and now it seems that Iran is starting to notice their movements. Meanwhile, the Allied forces in the air are gradually paving the way, while other forces in the region that have long had an interest in Iranian territory seem to be just waiting for the right opportunity to attack. At this point, just a few more steps, and Iran may be forced to fight a large-scale ground war, and this could possibly happen on multiple fronts or directions of battle. So for now, let's talk about what could possibly happen next and why this is so important to the whole world. But before we start that, if you're new to our channel, please don't forget to subscribe so you'll always be updated with videos like this. Brewing in the background. For those observing the situation in Iran and geopolitical analysts from different parts of the world, it was a very unusual Wednesday, the 4th of March. Within the previous 48 hours before that, open-source intelligence trackers and regional experts noticed some signs that seemed to indicate a major operation was moving behind the news. Rumors were gradually growing stronger that a possible Kurdish offensive against Iran might begin. That evening, a report from the Israeli media outlet at 24 News seemed to break the news that could change everything. According to their report, thousands of Kurdish fighters had allegedly begun their assault, crossing the border using armored convoys heading south. Unverified videos quickly spread. Several well-known journalists with deep connections in the region also picked up the news. But almost as quickly as the news spread, it suddenly died down. Several respected experts who are in direct contact with Kurdish leaders and sources on the ground said that the offensive has not actually started yet. And if there really was going to be a major battle, it would be expected that social media would be filled with new videos and reports from the ground itself. But almost nothing is coming out. The next day, most claims that the offensive had begun were retracted. Nevertheless, even as those reports were being withdrawn, major news outlets continue to discuss the possibility that a Kurdish advance toward Iran might begin soon. Here at Noel Polo TV, we can't say exactly how the international geopolitics community became confused about these reports. However, there are some things that we have now clearly confirmed. First, as of the time this episode was written, no major Kurdish offensive has begun yet. Small movements or initial advances in the border zone may have caused the confusion. Second, even though the offensive hasn't started yet, Kurdish forces continue to gather at the Iranian border. And third, once this offensive actually begins, its operations will be large and serious. Now, for us to really understand what happened in these situations, we first need to go back to some important basic information. The Kurds are a large diaspora population. It is estimated that there are 25 to 30 million Kurds living in the Middle East, and an additional 5 to 10 million scattered in different parts of the world. Despite their large number, they do not actually have their own country. Instead, they claim a vast region called Kurdistan, a land that is now divided among modern countries such as Turkey, Iran, Iraq, and Syria. Within Iran, most of the Kurds live in the northwestern region near the border of northern Iraq. On the Iraqi side, there is what is called Iraqi Kurdistan, a semi-autonomous region where the Kurds have a high degree of self-governance. And according to reports, it is in this very place where Kurdish fighters are gradually gathering, preparing for a possible major operation against Iran. Kurdish forces have a long history of cooperating with Western countries. This includes the United States, but that relationship has not always been smooth, especially because of the influence of one of the biggest rivals in the region, which is Turkey. Kurdish fighters are typically not one organization. They are divided into paramilitary groups, each with separate leadership and agendas. Sometimes they work together for a common goal. However, there are also times when they go in different directions. In Iran, the Kurdish minority has been under the control of the Islamic Republic for decades. These are groups aiming to achieve autonomy or independence for the Kurdish region in Iran, a place they call Rojalat. They are often forced to operate from outside the country, in neighboring territories. In short, the Kurdish population in the Middle East has many experienced fighters and has long dreamed of controlling or liberating Iranian Kurdistan, even though they have not been able to achieve this for many decades. And now, there are powerful countries that could possibly benefit from their help, particularly the United States and Israel. On the seventh day of the ongoing war against Iran, the tactical successes of the US and Israel are noticeable. In some parts of Iranian airspace, large non-stealth bomber aircraft are able to fly almost unimpeded. Many of the former leaders of the Iranian regime have already been eliminated, and at present, Iran also lacks the capability to directly challenge the air and naval superiority of their enemies. However, even so, the US and Israel are still far from achieving their biggest goal, especially since even Washington itself does not seem to have a clear idea of what its exact end goal really is. Inside Iran, a widespread uprising of citizens against the government has still not occurred. Meanwhile, decentralized Iranian forces continue to launch ballistic missiles and long-range drones against American bases in Israeli territory and at various targets in the Persian Gulf and throughout the Middle East. It is clear that Washington is indicating that one of their goals is regime change in Iran. However, at present, there is still no clear way to achieve that except for the continued bombing and defense of the region's airspace, while there are still bombs and air defense missiles left. Another alternative is to send ground troops. However, it seems that the United States is determined to avoid this step for as long as possible. The Trump administration knows that there will be a huge political cost if they send large ground forces to Iran. Israel also cannot do that alone. Israel's military doctrine is primarily focused on defending its own territory, not on acquiring or occupying vast lands in other countries. And this is where the Kurdish fighters come in, a large group of skilled paramilitary forces who have the capability and motivation to enter Iran and could help in the strategy of the United States. Axios reports that preparations have been underway for months. The Israeli Mossad and the US CIA are said to be leading the organization and preparation of the Kurdish forces. There are also reports that funding from the US and Israel is going to the Kurdish groups. According to US Secretary of State Marco Rubio, Israel is the main supplier of weapons to the Kurdish fighters. Meanwhile, the New York Times reported that the CIA has also sent small arms to some Iranian Kurdish groups in recent years. Although the offensive did not begin on Wednesday as initially reported in the news, there is still plenty of evidence showing that a major operation is about to happen. Just last month, 5 major Kurdish Iranian political parties united to form a coalition, a move that unites their armed wings or military forces. According to some reports, the United States has also held several talks with the leaders of various Kurdish factions. There was even an instance where the President of the United States personally participated in a call. In private meetings, it is said that Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu demonstrates his deep knowledge about the Kurdish fighting groups and the possible battle plans that may happen in the future. In public, the White House denied on Wednesday that they have any coordination with the Kurdish forces regarding any upcoming offensive. However, based on what happened during the actual operation, the actions seem to show otherwise. In recent days, the US and Israel have been bombing Iranian targets more frequently in the northwest region, the same area where the Kurdish fighters are expected to enter. It seems that Iran has also realized what could really happen. Proof of this is their missile and drone strikes against the offices of Kurdish political parties, as well as their warning of massive retaliation if any Kurdish advance begins. In interviews with international journalists on Wednesday, Kurdish leaders denied that any offensive would begin at that time. However, many of them also admitted that the operation was in the preparation stage. However, not all Kurdish groups are united in this plan. There are some Kurdish authorities, especially within Iranian Kurdistan, who indicate that they do not support or will not help in any military operation. And even in the international community, there are also experts who do not fully support the idea of this offensive. Many experts also warn that if a Kurdish offensive inside Iran proceeds, It could increase the risk of civil war or widespread unrest within the country. For others, it seems like this is just repeating the mistakes of the past, especially what happened in Syria, where the United States cooperated with Kurdish fighters to achieve their military objectives. Eventually, they too were abandoned in a complex situation. These concerns are real and serious, and it's also possible that if the offensive begins, it could lead to a major strategic mistake that would worsen the situation in the entire region. But despite those warnings, all sides still have strong reasons why they want to try this now. For the United States and Israel, it's a big deal if they have friendly ground forces inside Iran, especially if they don't have to risk the lives of their own soldiers in the actual fighting. As for the Kurdish groups in Iran, they see this situation as a rare opportunity that may only come once in a generation, a chance to reclaim or strengthen control over their ancestral lands. In addition, the Kurdish diaspora throughout the Middle East has enough fighters who can be sent into battle. They also have a reason to look for new territories that they can control after some changes in the region. For example, the former Kurdish enclave in Syria has almost been dismantled. Meanwhile, in Turkey, a government amnesty deal has imposed stricter conditions that make it harder for armed Kurdish groups to stay and operate there. In other words, there are forces looking for new places where they can gather and continue their objectives. However, even so, this does not change the fact that the dangers are still significant. There is a real possibility that a Kurdish offensive in Iran could lead to a major disaster or destabilization of the entire region. Nevertheless, in the current situation, it seems that the conditions are just right for each side to believe that the risks they face are worth it. The curse of the offensive. As of now, while this report is being written, it is not yet certain exactly when the Kurdish offensive against Iran will begin. However, based on the movements already seen on the ground and reports from various sources, there is a good idea of how this offensive might unfold once it fully begins. The Kurdish forces are expected to come from the western side, crossing the border from northern Iraq into Iranian territory. It is also possible that advanced units have already captured or entered some border outposts in the first line of Iran's defense, positions that were supposed to be the first to block them. In fact, over 100 Iranian military positions have already been reported hit in previous operations. This suggests that somehow, the Kurdish forces have had the opportunity to establish an initial foothold or a small controlled area inside Iranian territory. When the offensive finally begins, thousands of Kurdish fighters are expected to participate. They will use armored vehicles, mortar systems, and artillery to support their advance. The Iranian Kurdish militias, with an estimated 2,500 fighters, will likely lead the first wave of the attack. However, on the other side, the Iraqi Peshmerga forces are said to have up to 200,000 fighters that can be called upon if necessary. In the air support is expected to come from the United States and Israel. In addition, Kurdish fighters may also use unmanned drones, not only for attacks but also for aerial surveillance and intelligence gathering around the battlefield. There is a possibility, even if small, that the Kurdish forces could achieve a quick breakthrough similar to what the Syrian rebel offensive did in late 2024, where they quickly entered enemy territories. However, in reality, that is not the most likely outcome. There's a greater possibility that the goal of this offensive is not to immediately capture a large part of Iran, but to force the Iranian military to overstretch or exhaust their capabilities on multiple fronts. If the Kurdish fighters advance, Iran will be forced to gather large units of soldiers to confront them. They will need to deploy their tanks, heavy armor, and a large number of troops, gathering them in dense formations in order to fight. And this is where the situation becomes dangerous for Iran. When their forces gather in large groups, they become easier targets for airstrikes from the US and Israel. In other words, Iran has almost no other choice. If they don't take strong action against the incoming Kurdish forces, these groups will have a clear path into their territory. As for the direction of the assault, it's unlikely that the offensive will head straight to Tehran, the capital of Iran. Instead, it will probably concentrate on areas that are several hundred kilometers away from the capital. It's far enough not to pose an immediate direct threat to Tehran, but close enough to force Iran to send reinforcements from the capital to deal with the attacks. If that happens, the defenses around Tehran could be gradually depleted as more troops are sent to other fronts. If this plan succeeds, many things could happen. The Iranian military could become overstretched and lose control of parts of the country. It's also possible that by withdrawing many forces from the capital, the United States could seize the opportunity for a large-scale uprising of citizens inside Tehran. There's another possibility, and that is Iran might not be able to properly coordinate their troops, which could completely destroy the remaining capability of their military command and control system. And if that happens, a Kurdish offensive could open a new phase in this war, a phase that could bring even bigger changes throughout the entire region. Another possibility being discussed by analysts is the deployment of a small number of American or Israeli soldiers on the ground, not as the main fighting force, but as military advisors. In fact, this is a normal tactic in many operations conducted by the United States and their allies in the Middle East. They usually let the local forces take on most of the fighting on the ground, while special units from the US or allied countries provide advanced support and guidance for the operation. This includes special forces, intelligence, paramilitary units, and other highly trained troops who are skilled at operating in this kind of environment. Their role is not just to give advice. They can also coordinate precision airstrikes, provide tactical guidance on the battlefield, access advanced military technology, and, if necessary, they can even lead the very first wave of the attack. For now, it's still just speculation whether there are really American or Israeli troops helping the Kurdish forces in this way. But if this does happen, it wouldn't be unusual because the US and their allies have done this many times in the past. However, this kind of ground offensive carries a high risk of miscalculation. This is not because there is a high possibility that the Iranian military will completely defeat the Kurdish forces. That's possible, but according to most analysts, it's also not very likely, just as it's unlikely that the Kurdish fighters will completely capture Tehran. The bigger risk is something else. A Kurdish advance inside Iran could provoke a strong reaction from the Iranian citizens themselves. Even if there are some Iranians who don't support the current regime or who were glad to see some government leaders gone, they might still unite against an invasion coming from outside the country. If that happens, the Iranians might become even more united against the invading forces, and the course of the war could completely change. In this situation, Iran would face a higher risk of civil war, widespread chaos or instability, and a crisis that could last not just for a few months, but even beyond the year 2026. Even now, there are Iranians who are doubtful about the air campaign by the US and Israel. One of the reasons is the inconsistent statements of American leaders about their true objective in the war. In addition, the US and Israel have repeatedly called on Iranians to rise up against their government, even though it is not yet clear if conditions are sufficient for this kind of uprising to succeed. If the possibility of ethnic conflicts and the dangers of Iran's territory being divided by foreign forces are not addressed, many Iranians may feel that the fall of the current regime is not worth the risk. And it's not only Iran that may have to pay the price. The Kurdish forces may also face significant sacrifices. Iran may launch powerful missile strikes against Kurdish bases in Iraq, and there is another, more complicated danger: the possible direct intervention of Turkey to prevent the Kurdish fighters from establishing new territory. But there's a more dangerous possibility. If the Kurdish offensive succeeds, other groups besides the Kurds may also try to break away from Iran. In the south of Iranian Kurdistan, there are areas where the Arab population of Iran has long wanted to have their own autonomy. In the southern region of the country, there is Sistan, Balochistan, where the ethnic Baloch have long been fighting for greater freedom, not only within Iran, but also in areas across the border in Pakistan. There are even some reports saying that the US and Israel are also communicating with certain Baloch groups known for their ability to carry out complex insurgent operations. But perhaps the most dangerous possibility of all is the situation in the north. Along the Caspian Sea, you'll find the country of Azerbaijan, a neighbor of Iran that may have its own interests in any changes to the balance of power in the region. In the northern part of Iran, there is a large population of ethnic Azeris. Because of this, there has long been a sensitive issue regarding the relationship of this region with the neighboring country of Azerbaijan. In recent years, the leader of Azerbaijan, Ilham Aliyev, has made jokes or perhaps hints about the possibility of claiming some parts of northern Iran. Among the places he has mentioned are the city of Tabriz, as well as the wider territory in the north of Iran. It is also well known that Aliyev is a leader who is not afraid to use military force if necessary. A clear example of this happened a few years ago when Azerbaijan took control of the Nagorno-Karabakh region from Armenia. In addition, Aliyev is also known for having close ties with the United States, especially through major development and energy projects that the two countries are working on together. Now he may feel that he has another reason to act. Just a few days ago, an Iranian drone reportedly struck the city of Nakhchivan, a territory of Azerbaijan, and in response, Aliyev immediately ordered his military to prepare for possible retaliation. In fact, even before that incident happened, Azerbaijani soldiers were already making movements near the border with Iran. Many troops were placed on combat alert, and some soldiers were even recalled from their leave to immediately return to service. In fact, this is the reason why a Kurdish offensive in the northwestern part of Iran could have such a significant impact. For the United States and Israel, this could be an opportunity to draw out Iran's forces, disperse their troops, and gradually weaken the capability of their military. When Iran's troops are spread out on different fronts, they become easier targets for airstrikes, and it becomes more difficult for them to defend the entire country. If this plan succeeds, it could pave the way for the eventual collapse of the current regime in Iran. But along with the potential and success comes a tremendous danger. Once the domino effect of uprisings and attacks begins, it may not be just the Kurdish insurgents who take action. It's also possible that the Baloch insurgents in the southeast, the Arab group in the south, and even the Azerbaijanis in the north could join in if they see an opportunity to change the balance of power in the region. If that happens, an offensive that started in one region could expand into a much wider crisis that could change the entire Middle East. And there's another possible outcome. Instead of Iran falling apart, it's possible that the Iranians could unite against the external threat. In this situation, an operation that was expected to weaken the country could actually strengthen their unity even more. And if the planners miscalculate, it could result in decades of chaos, instability, and possibly a prolonged civil war in Iran. In the end, some strategists might think that the risk is worth it in exchange for the possibility of changing the regime in Iran. But right now, that's the calculation of the United States and their allies. They need to make sure their assessment is correct, because if not, the consequence could be a crisis bigger than expected.